Thank you so much for coming. So this workshop is called Personhood in Post-Suffering Community. My name is Lydia Bailey. I'm just going to introduce our speakers for today. Father Sean and Sangeetha are going to be presenting this workshop. The Reverend Dr. Sean A. Levine serves as an archpriest in the Orthodox Church in America and is an active duty Army chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel. He's currently stationed in the Military District of Washington, D.C., working at the Pentagon as the Force Structure Manager for the Office of the Chief of Chaplains. Father Sean holds Master of Arts degrees in Theological Studies and Biblical Studies from Asbury Theological Seminary, a Master of Divinity degree from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, a Master of Science degree in Marriage and Family Therapy from Texas A&M Central Texas, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Erskine Theological Seminary. His D.Min dissertation, Pastoral Guidance, Theological Anthropology, and the Art of Pastoral Care, applies an extensively researched Eastern Orthodox Christian view of the human person, theological anthropology, to an understanding and practice of intersubjective interaction in the active pastoral encounter, pastoral practice. He lives in Virginia with his wife of 34 years, Matushka Jennifer, and his youngest son, Andrew. His oldest son, Ethan, Ethan's wife, Alexandra, and their 1-year-old son, Philip, Father Sean's and Matushka Jennifer's first grandchild, live in San Antonio, Texas. And Sangeetha Thomas is a licensed professional counselor and the owner of M.A.B.S Counseling in Dallas, Texas. She's also the director of mental health ministries for the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the USA. As director, she collaborates with an interdisciplinary team of experts in mental health ministry and theology to create resources that support the mental health needs of Orthodox Christians across the United States. As a psychotherapist, Sangeetha works with adults of diverse backgrounds who are healing from trauma, exploring multicultural identity and intergenerational trauma as children of immigrants, and learning to integrate their spiritual identity. Please join me in welcoming Father Sean and Sangeetha.
Thank you all for being here, being a part of this workshop. I never know how many people are going to join one workshop when there's breakouts, so it's really nice to see a full room here. I will say there is going to be a partner activity towards the back end of this workshop, so if you could make sure that you have an even number at your tables, or we can just reshuffle when we get to the group activity, and that will be totally fine if you're already seated. It is my great pleasure to co-present with Father Sean Levine. He has been a consultant to the Assembly of Bishops Mental Health Ministries for a couple of years now, and is an extraordinary person who I've enjoyed getting to know as we talk about personhood. And it's been a pleasure to work with him as a consultant to create programs that attend to the mental health needs of Orthodox Christians in the U.S. So the way this workshop is going to be structured, Father Sean is going to start out talking about the theological anthropology of the human being and of human relationships. As if your mind wasn't already blown from this morning's presentation, he's going to blow your mind a little bit more. Then I'm going to facilitate a combination of a group activity where you'll be sitting in pairs, along with a neurobiological perspective on compassion. So that, followed by the remainder of the group activity, is going to be the chunk of the presentation. Then we'll pause, we'll give you some space for questions, and at the very end, we'll have a little bit of time. If we haven't completely run out of time with questions, we will leave some time to give some updates on the Assembly of Bishops Mental Health Ministries. Some of you I've met over the past years of coming to OCAMPR, so I'm really glad to see familiar faces, and I know some of you already have an understanding of the Assembly of Bishops. Some of you are here for the first time, and this is your first OCAMPR conference, so I want to make sure that we can share some basic information as well as updates on what's new with the ministry. So that will happen at the very end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Father Sean, and he will jump into the theological anthropology of the human being and human relationships.
Awesome. Thanks, Sangeetha. All right. So, yeah, we've already been swimming in some of this morning.
I'll go in a couple of different directions, but I would hope not to deviate from the foundation that we received this morning already. So we'll see. So in the work of health and healing, chaplaincy, I was recently asked to talk about. This was the theme of a conference for Army chaplains, was how healthy people build healthy relationships and healthy communities. And being the kind of person that I am, largely contentious with a big mouth, I said, what do you mean by healthy? What do you mean by people? What do you mean by make? What do you mean by healthy? And what do you mean by relationships and community? So I began to force the definition of questions, of terms, and ask these kinds of questions of what person are we talking about? Like, we talk about healthy people, healthy communities, healthy relationships. What does any of that mean? Because in the realm of, social science and such, those words can have a diverse lineage. So I'm gonna talk for a few minutes about the human person from multiple angles, and that's how we'll start. You have to begin here. I would argue you have to begin here. The idea that God, according to Genesis, God puts his hands, if you will, into the mud and forms the human being from the dirt and the water of the ground, and then breathes into that figure's nostrils the breath of life. A lot of times this is translated in and man became a living soul, or a living being. The Hebrew is a bit complex there, and actually it basically suggests that at the work of God, by God's breath, the human being became a living life, or one who is alive, or a living one, or simply a living. Because the word soul there, or the word translated soul, isn't meant to suggest the kind of soul that we typically think of, something extra, kind of implanted into something, a soul. It's the idea that this thing that was 1 minute a clod of dirt became alive at the breath of God. So if we're talking about the human person, whether it's in the world of medical science or social science or theological reflection, I think we have to start here. And I would argue that a lot of times in the world of scientific study, this is not where we start. This is not where people typically begin. This is a theological vision of the human person that is not considered a valid construct, which is unfortunate. And then you have the quote from the Epistle of Barnabas, made popular for me by Father John Bear's work. The human being is mud that suffers. That's the human person. That's the place I think we begin to talk about what is the human being. Now, these are non-empirical categories. This is not the way that empirical studies would talk about the human being. It's a subjective vision of the human person, rather than making the human being, what Father talked about this morning, an object. An object is something that's thrown before. It's tossed in front of. To objectify something is to take hold of it and to throw it in front of one's vision. To first capture it and then to place it in front, and that's the object. This is a subjective reality, so it's underneath. It goes underneath that capability of grasping fully and empirically and scientifically and tossing it around as a thing that can be manipulated. So I'm going to talk about three theological or subjective visions of human personhood. First of all, the ecclesial hypostasis, the subject versus the biological hypostasis, which is an object. This comes from, I'll show you in a minute, but from the work of Metropolitan John Zizulis. The becoming human person versus the finished product. A lot of times what I find when I go to conferences with other chaplains who are doing people helping work is the assumption is always that they're dealing with mature and fully formed human persons. And so a lot of ideas come out of that which are perhaps slightly inaccurate, and rather than the idea that the human being is a becoming in this world, the human person is a becoming reality, and something. It's a trajectory and a pathway, not a product. We'll talk about that. And of course, you're familiar with the finished person that people think that they're dealing with as the biopsychosocio-spiritual person, the individual. And this, of course, is kind of a developmental orientation, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with that construct unless it's considered the thing. It's a way of looking at the human person, but from a grander vision, I think we have to take a higher vantage so that doesn't become reductive. So the becoming human person, and then the phenomenological human being, which is a philosophical concept versus the scientific human being or the empirical thing. So that's a couple. One, this is, of course, from Being as Communion. The biological hypostasis is this modern, divided. It's interesting because we talk about the individual usually as the singular thing, but the word itself has a sense of not being divided, and then we divide it into bio-psycho-socio-spiritual dynamics. It's pulled apart. You have to pull it apart into pieces to do the empirical work. This is what Metropolitan John Zazoulis would refer to as the biological hypostases. And this particular vision of the person, the person born into the world as a biological reality, is characterized by ontological necessity. Nobody asked me if I wanted to come into this world. You just come into this world by necessity. So the very essence of a lack of freedom, as we were talking about this morning, and radical isolation, separatedness, is the characteristic of the biological hypostasis. The ecclesial hypostasis, on the other hand, is the human being constituted in and by the communion of the church. It's a very different vision. You can see the biological hypostasis, and you can divide that into bio, psycho, socio, spiritual dynamics. The ecclesial hypostasis is an article of faith. It's the ecclesial human being formed in the love that constitutes the church. And so the ecclesial hypostatic existence, this way of being in the world as an ecclesial person constituted by the sacramental life of the church, is not an empirical category. You can't see that. You can't put that under a microscope, and you can't empirically verify it. It's a way of talking about the human person from a theological perspective. Again, that is not constitutive of most scientific conversations. So the ecclesial hypostasis, article of faith, constituted by the church. That's the first angle, the first side of the prism. Second, the becoming human person. This is not unfamiliar probably to many of you. St. Ignatius of Antioch's epistle to the Romans, His Grace referred to this last night in his talk. Neither the end, I know this is quoting from St. Ignatius. Neither the ends of the world nor the kingdoms of this age profit me anything. It's better for me to die in Jesus Christ than to reign over the ends of the earth. Him I seek, the one who died on our behalf. Him I desire, him who rose up for us. The pangs of birth are upon me. This letter was written to the Roman Christians in order to encourage them not to get in the way of Ignatius's martyrdom. Whatever you do, don't stop this from happening. I'm coming to Rome. I'm coming as a martyr. Don't get involved. Leave this alone, because it's better for me to die in Christ than to have the kingdoms of this world. And he says, the pangs of birth are upon me. So he's not yet born. Most of the time when people are dealing with human beings in this world, they assume birth. How else would you have gotten here? But Ignatius says, I'm not yet born. Grant me this, brothers, do not hinder me from living. Do not hinder me from living. In other words, don't get in the way of my death. Life and death start to get flipped around. Do not wish that I should die by remaining alive. If you interrupt my martyrdom, it'll be death to me. If I die as a martyr, then I can live. Do not give the world the one who wishes to be God's, nor charm him with the material. Allow me to attain the pure light. When I have arrived there, I will be a human being. Not yet born, not yet living, and not yet human. Fully human, one could say. Again, we have this nature that we are participating in, but it requires perfecting. And he says, when I get there, I will be finally a human being, a fully formed human person. Most of the time when we deal with clients, patients, confessees, spiritual children, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we're dealing with what the world looks at as the human person. Fully formed entity, born into this world, alive. And the reality is that if we take this paradigm seriously, we've not yet been born, we are not yet living, and we are not yet human in the fullest sense of any of those words. So something provisional has happened. We've been birthed into this world. We are alive. We're moving around, heartbeat, blood flowing, some form of life. That is happening.
Or larva.
Larva, that's a nice way to put it. Perhaps one could think of a caterpillar in a chrysalis. You know, it's all there. It's all there, but it's not there in its fullness. And so we are becoming. We are becoming. And in fact, the final stage of that becoming is our death. That's birth. That's why many of the saints, we celebrate many of the saints' days on the day of their death, because that's their birth. Every time we talk about some form of transformation sacramentally in the Orthodox Church, whether it's baptism or marriage or tonsuring for monastic vow, there's all this imagery of death. Because we are, as Paul said, we are dying daily. And until we finally just stop dying daily and die, we are dying into ourselves. There isn't this ascent from birth, this kind of ascent of well-being, and then we're living. Oh, something bad happens now. We're dying, we're dead. That would be a biopsychosocio-spiritual idea of life in the world. We are from the moment of our birth dying. And we are moving through that death toward ourselves, the self that we can never be fully in this world, because it requires transition to the life of the age to come. The becoming human person. So this is what we have just said, that we have to die into our own reality. So as I said this morning after morning prayers, the idea of human flourishing, what it means to be a growing person, how you look at life in this world is different from different angles. For us as Orthodox Christians, from a theological perspective, we are dying into life. The final step is the last heartbeat, which we're always subtracting. On your healthiest day in this life, I don't know what day that would be, the healthiest one, physically, mentally, biopsychosocio-spiritually healthy day, the best one, you're still subtracting heartbeats. One at a time, the number is reducing. -1, -1, -1, -1. On the healthiest day, you're still dying. If you can spend your life as the world often does, trying to cling to this life, and if you do that, you'll lose it, as Jesus said, whereas if you give it up for my sake in the gospel, you find it. If you die to that other vision of clinging, you come alive to life in death. Suffering, of course, is constitutive of the human experience, and co-suffering is constitutive of the community of persons, because all of us are subject to death and decay. Like we're decaying into death. I've told this story a couple of times. I was counseling with a couple one time. This really hit home. I was sitting with a couple doing marriage and family work, and I kind of lost track of what they were saying for a minute, which is not an uncommon thing, when you're just listening to people hour after hour. And my eyes kind of glazed over, and I saw the two of them disintegrate from the head to the feet and fall under their chairs and became little piles of dirt. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm watching their mouths move, and then this kind of holographic vision of them disintegrating. And then I had the sense that I was also disintegrating and falling through my chair. And the question was, just exactly what are we doing here? What is this that we're trying to, what am I doing? Recognizing the fact that the destiny of all three of us was to become a pile of dirt in a box. How does that shape, what does that do to our vision of wellness and healing, the practices of healing, when we recognize that we're all literally dissolving? And you leave bits and pieces of yourself everywhere you go. You breathe into the air, the DNA is in the moisture that comes out of your lungs, little hairs are falling off, skin cells. Somebody could probably find us, all of us in this room, years later with the right kind of mechanism, looking for, there's, fingernails and hangnails and eyelashes and, we're leaving we're falling apart everywhere. We're leaving ourselves behind everywhere that we go. How does that shape what we think about healing and providing healing, helping people to find healing in our professions? The church is the community of those dying into life and living through death. One more vision. I do a lot of work with continental philosophy, French phenomenology. I'm not really good at it yet. I'm still getting the lingo down and such, but I'm going to take a crack at it because I think it's pretty cool. I do a lot of reading with Michel Henry, who is a French, probably one of the most influential French phenomenologists that I'm aware of. And he turned his attention toward Christianity at the end of his life. Wrote 3 books about a phenomenological vision of Christianity, and it's really quite powerful. And Father John Bear uses that in his book on John, the Gospel of John, the 3rd part of his book, which got me kind of all fired up about this. But again, we're not talking about an empirical category. We're talking about something that's invisible and non-objectifiable, the phenomenological human being, the person from the philosophical perspective. The human being instantiates a transcendental category. So this is not an empirical category. The human being is, first of all, I would say, a theological and philosophical category. It is, in fact, from Henri's perspective, if I could dare to summarize what he writes, the coming into itself of invisible life, capital L, in and as the life, little l, of the living human person. And of course, that living and human person are all qualified by not yet born, not yet living, not yet fully human, but it's life coming into itself in the life of the living human person. And so life, as a category itself, does not actually appear in the light of this world. The biology that science studies is often very much linked to death. You've got to rip something apart and rip it open to see what's in there. And the paradigm is not so much life, but death. You can see a person alive in this world. You cannot see the life of that person, because the only person who can experience that life is that person. It's fundamentally unique and non-generalizable. And that's exactly what science does. It generalizes. And so you would erase the life of the person by generalizing the person's into categories, bio, psycho, socio, spiritual, etc. Add an adjective, and you're generalizing, and Henri would suggest that is the death of the person from a philosophical perspective. And so life does not appear in this world. You try to see it, and it runs from you. It will flee into the corners of obscurity and into the apophatic reality of the human person as a life that cannot be visibly obtained. Life cannot be seen as projected or objected or objectify it against the visible horizon of this world. What you get when you do that is death. Parts and pieces and programs. Life only manifests in its fullest reality in the subjective, affective invisibility of living it. The lived experience, the felt sense. And that can't be put under a microscope. Life's arrival in and to each unique, unrepeatable, irreducible human person. That's the phenomenological human being, and adds an interesting essence to the conversation about what it means to be human, which is why I present it here. So that's three pictures: ecclesial, the becoming, and the phenomenological human being. None of these are empirical categories. They're non-empirical categories. They cannot be microscoped or generalized. They are visions of human personhood, much like the one that we heard this morning. Like, none of what Father said this morning can be put under a microscope or scienced. You can't science that. That's pure theological and philosophical reflection. And it's the foundation of any starting point to talk about human personhood, in my opinion. So the self that we're talking about here, life coming into itself, a constant effervescence of life coming into itself in each person, an infinite welling up in living flesh, wherein the sensible and sensing person lives life as a conscious recipient of and participation in God's life. That's the human being. It's personal, subjective, immanent. It's my felt life, and it's the arrival of that life into the conscious human person. Irreducible to generalizations, so you can't generalize this, and it's individual and unique. So what we've done is what I would call the first parts of a theological phenomenology of life and personhood, from an orthodox perspective, asking for some other voices to come in and be part of that. Shifting to intersubjectivity or relationship now, what does that mean? So the community is a transcendental ontology. A community is also something you can't see in the light of this world. Well, but wait a minute, we can see a group of people. Well, a group of people is not necessarily a community. Or, said differently, what you see when you look with your eyes at a gathering of people is not a community. Community is an invisible reality. It's a transcendental category. It's a category of life. It's the same life that we were just talking about that wells up in itself and comes into existence in this effervescence that cannot be visualized. It's invisible in the light of this world against the outside horizon of visibility, which is the foundation of all empirical work. Human beings do not build communities. So this is one part of my answer to how healthy people build healthy communities. They do not. They participate in community. It's this invisible a priori. It's before. And we are gifted to participate in it as we come together and intentionally gather. We don't create something like that. We participate in it. So if we come together as a Eucharistic community, we become, as a Eucharistic community, that which we were not as a group, as individuals, or even as a group of individuals, because we participate in a reality that is prior. We don't make that. We participate in it, and it can't be found. Where do you go to look for that? Where is that bonding thing that makes this group of people a community? Where is it? Go find me a box of that. You can't find that. It's invisible. It's transcendental. What sociology and social science can see in community is the observable, interpreted patterns of human behavior that we metabolize as objectifying generalizations. This is what community is. Often it gets co-opted into various ideologies. But that's not community. It's invisible, can't be seen as a category of life. And so we're talking, of course, about the difference between ontological reality, much of which we cannot see, the real being, versus ontic expressions of things, the visible, measurable characteristics that show up. If we reduce everything to the visible, measurable characteristics, then we miss the ontological depth and foundation. Communion, then, as the essence of community, it's an ontological reality that can't be reduced to what can be seen as people gather for worship. You can see people gather for worship. What you cannot see with your eyes is the community. The communion lives beyond representational intersubjectivity. It's beyond just people together in a place. With respect to its essence, the members of the community are thus not something extrinsic, a mere addition or an effect of odd or empirical circumstances. They are not empirical elements that, put together by chance, would suddenly form a community. Only the living, absolute subjectivities, phenomenological human persons, enter into the community of life. Life is the shared dynamic that makes community possible. We don't create it, we can't see it, and you can't manipulate it. It just is. And it's not visible. Maximus the Confessor says something similar, maybe not the same. When the logi of particular things join themselves to the universal logi, they affect unions between divided things. For the more universal logi encompass in a unifying way the logi of the particular, and it is to these universal logi that particular things naturally have reference. So a beyond. It's not just particular things jammed together that suddenly explode into community or gathering. It's a participation in a prior reality. Coming to a close here. The result of the freedom that John Zazoulis talks about in his book, and that we heard something about this morning. The result of this freedom of the person from nature, of the hypostasis from biology in particular, not the kind of nature that we were talking about this morning, is that in the church, man transcends exclusivism. The human being transcends exclusivism. Thus, a characteristic of the ecclesial hypostasis is the capacity of the person to love without exclusiveness. When he talks about transcending nature, he's talking about moving from the biological hypostasis that we were talking about earlier to the ecclesial hypostasis, that you break out of ontological necessity because baptism and becoming a member of the church is an act of one's freedom. And if you live in that, then you have gone beyond the idea. You're using your life now as a martyr, intentionally living a life beyond ontological necessity. And part of that makes possible community, the coming into being of community, because we are given the capability of loving without exclusion. This overcomes the radical isolation that is part of the biological hypostasis. He goes on to say, this means that only in the church has man the power to express himself as a Catholic person. Catholicity, as a characteristic of the church, permits the person to become a hypostasis without falling into individuality, biopsychosocio-spiritual individuality, because in the church two things are realized simultaneously. The world is presented to man not as mutually exclusive portions, which he is called to unite a posteriori, but as a single whole, which is expressed in a Catholic manner without division in every concrete being. Simultaneously, the same person comes to express and realize a Catholic presence in the world and an hypostasis which is not an individual, but an authentic person. Lastly, this all can coalesce in a conversation about co-suffering, because we're talking about the ecclesial person living together living with others in the Eucharistic community. This sort of co-suffering can only happen in the church. That kind of love can only happen in the ecclesial community, because ecclesial existence overcomes biological necessity, those two characteristics, and radical isolation. These are overcome in the ecclesial existence of the ecclesial hypostasis in the communion of the church. God is love, not an ideology or a cause or a modality. And so we have to approach that God in that kind of community as those kinds of people to experience this radical human reality. Love your neighbor as yourself, and the question was, who's my neighbor? Jesus doesn't answer that question. He makes us the neighbor to everyone in the way that he answers that question. And so that's the basis for our life of compassion and of trying to co-suffer with others in our particular ways. So at some level, we are all in this together. The human race as a group, it's a brother and sisterhood in life. And we're called to respond to others in that way. And so empathy and compassion, which is part of the theme of this workshop, empathy and compassion, those are reasonable responses to an Orthodox Christian vision of the human being, as we've talked about it here. And we'll say more about that as the presentation goes on. That's my portion. That's kind of the theory. And now I'll give this to Sangeetha to talk more about the neurobiology and practice of compassion.
Thank you. So I know that was a lot. Thank you, Father Sean. I'm going to give you all a second to just digest what he just said. So because I'm about to jump into more of the science side of things. All right. So this is going to feel like a little bit of a hard turn, and I am going to stand here on the side because I'm vertically challenged. So if I stand behind the podium, you really will have a hard time seeing me. So this is going to feel like a hard turn, and then we're going to kind of knit the two of them together at the end. It is going to feel a little odd to go from theology and philosophical thinking and phenomenology, which is hard to say, suddenly into neurobiology. But I am a therapist, and so I'm going to stick to my lane. I also take a general approach of neurobiology in the approach of psychotherapy. So I do my best to use that in my clinical practice. If that's your language, you're going to love this. If that's not, I'm going to keep it real simple, so don't worry about it too much. Can I just see by a show of hands how many people are mental health professionals here? Great. And how many people are medical professionals? And how many are theologians or theology background? Great. So we have a good mix. That's awesome. All right. So our brain has many functions. One of the strongest functions that we have, which is one of the most primitive functions that we have, is survival. Right? It's something that we share with the animals. The brain is constantly scanning for threat. And it does this about 4 to 5 times in a second. That's what it's designed to do so that we can survive. Most of the time, we're not conscious of this. We're not aware of that scanning 4 to 5 times in a second, unless there's some kind of emotion involved, right? If you start scanning for threat, what happens is, at some point in that process, you're going to feel fear or worry or concern, and then you become more conscious that, oh, okay, I'm scanning for a threat, and now I feel that threat has been detected. So we don't notice this, but it is very much a part of our nature. It is, or maybe I shouldn't use the word nature now that we had this morning's presentation, but it is very much a part of our biological wiring. And the reason I'm starting with this is because this workshop is about compassion. The definition, the literal definition of compassion is to suffer with. And when I look into the compassion research, when I look into the neurobiology of compassion, what we learn is that compassion in the brain, when we do an fMRI, looks like a stress response, which is kind of odd because most of the time when we use the word compassion, we're talking about being kind, being nice, being altruistic, being benevolent, whatever. We're talking about those warm and fuzzy feelings. We don't think stress response. So I'm going to go into a little bit of that. What is a stress response? Typically, for anybody who is not a medical professional or mental health professional, typically a stress response goes from the body up to the brain, triggers your insula, which is a structure in the brain that basically says something is wrong. That we may or may not be fully aware of, but like I said, when there's an emotion involved, we start to become a little bit more aware and experiencing something is off in my inner world. And that can feel kind of like spidey sense. Then it moves to the amygdala. The amygdala, for the most part, when I describe the amygdala, I describe it as a barking dog, because I have a dog that barks every time the doorbell rings. And it is an instant response. It's doorbell, bark, doorbell, bark. And there's really not a gap for me when I'm doing telehealth sessions to jump in the middle and get him to settle down. But that's the role of the amygdala, is there's a threat, bark, something's wrong. And the amygdala's job is to tell you, pay attention to that, right? It's that little voice that says, what was that? What was that? I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Then we move from the amygdala to activation in the prefrontal cortex. Now that's the part that sits right here behind your forehead. It is the most advanced part of your brain, and it is the part that synthesizes all of this information. You're taking in all of these stimuli from your body and your brain, and your amygdala is saying, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, bark, 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 bark. And your prefrontal cortex has the job of making sense of it and trying to come up with some kind of strategic response. What are we going to do? What is appropriate for me to do? What can I do? What should I do? All happens in that prefrontal cortex. So, a healthy stress response cycle. You're going to feel that stimulus. Amygdala is going to say, pay attention. Prefrontal cortex is going to say, okay, I'm paying attention. I took in all the information. I came up with a response. And then we close that stress cycle. We close that loop. And the prefrontal cortex will say, all right, amygdala, hush, stop barking. We're out of danger now, right? And you see this happen in a matter of seconds, not even minutes for most people. If you ever watch nature documentaries or if you have a dog or if you have an animal, you'll see they get stressed, they get amped up, and then usually they will shake or sneeze or kind of, I don't know, do something to reset their nervous system. Humans are not always great about closing that stress cycle, and so that's why a lot of times with therapy, our work is to bring you back into your rest state. So that's a healthy cycle. That's adaptive functioning. It can become maladaptive if the amygdala, that barking dog, keeps barking and says, nope, I'm still under threat, I'm still under threat, I'm still under threat. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. If it keeps going without down-regulating, that's when we see those fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. Because basically your brain is saying, I have to survive. I need to survive. So it triggers this survival mechanism. And I want you to keep that in mind while we go into what makes compassion different. So compassion starts exactly the same way. There's a signal from the body up to the brain that says something is wrong. Through your insula, then your amygdala says, pay attention. And your prefrontal cortex says, let me take more information, let me figure out what to do. What's different with compassion, although it starts exactly like a stress response, is that it then goes through a different neural circuit that allows you to take the perspective of another person. With every other stress response, you're thinking, how can I serve myself? It's self-serving, self-survival, right? But with compassion, it goes through a different circuit and says, what is the other person experiencing? And it takes that into consideration too. So it is a stress response, but it's an empathic stress response. One other thing to keep in mind is every other stress response, the goal with survival is also avoid pain or minimize pain as much as possible. So keep in mind this morning's presentation where Father Klinik was talking about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, how that's become a part of our nature. And I want you to see that and see how compassion is actually in contrast to that. Compassion is what enables somebody who is scared of snakes, a mother, for example, scared of snakes, to jump in front of a snake in order to save her child. To not be self-serving, but to take the perspective of another person and say, they are in danger, so I will jump in. And I know Father Sean is familiar with this working in the military, to put yourself in danger. Anybody who's worked with first responders knows that as well, that like a firefighter jumping into a burning building is an act of compassion. To see that someone else is suffering. Someone could be in there, and I have to jump in. Now, one other thing that's different with compassion, not only does it go through that neural circuitry of taking perspective of another person's experience, there's also this simultaneous changing where you bring down your fear circuitry and you raise up this approach motivation. How do I feel less afraid and increase my ability to approach a person who is suffering? All right, so I'm going to actually skip a slide here. All right, we're gonna go here. Just for the sake of time, we're skipping one little portion of the game that was more of the having fun portion. So we'll just get to business here. So that's okay. We'll get to it. All right. So there's 6 steps that the research has found. 6 steps of that compassion takes on as a process. So I want you to remember everything I just said about the compassion process or the stress response cycle, right? It starts with awareness. Something is wrong. Then it goes into connection. You take another person's perspective and you connect with a common sense of humanity, or using this morning's language, a common nature that we have with another person who is suffering. Then it moves into this 3rd step, which is motivation. And that's what I had just mentioned, is that compassion simultaneously reduces fear and increases or encourages motivation to connect. Then we have our 4th step, which is self-efficacy, which means believing that you can do something about it. You can do something about their suffering. Now, there are some sufferings that we have to expand our definition of what it means to do something about it. If someone is struggling with cancer or terminal illness, what can you do about it? You can sit with them. You can be present with them, right? So that self-efficacy is not necessarily like a literal taking away of the suffering. It is, in some situations, being present with the suffering is enough. And believing that that can make a difference is the self-efficacy. Then we have the 5th step, which is responding. That's the actual choice to act. So this morning, Father Klinik talked about free will, the freedom to act, and seeing that as a faculty of your nature. So I want you to see this responding, making the choice to then sit with the person. Not just think, oh man, they seem to be really having a hard time. That's just empathy, right? Maybe it's pity, or maybe it's something. It's just a feeling. But to actually get up from where you're sitting and say, I'm going to sit with this person who's sitting alone. That's actual response. And then, of course, we have the last item, which is satisfaction. So that's another thing that happens with compassion, which is different from every other stress response. So first of all, we have the perspective taking, which is different from every other stress response. We have the inhibition of fear circuitry and the encouraging of connection. And then the third difference is that when we do this, there's a release of oxytocin that also works with our dopamine reward system. So basically, you have a hormone that is telling you social connection and bonding and feeling close is what I want. And then you have a reward system that then rewards that and says, it feels good to do that. It feels good to transcend my self-will. It feels good to transcend my own fear and my own survival instinct and to be with another person. That feels good. Basically, your brain is telling you that, and that's the satisfaction that you feel at the end. So those are three things that set compassion apart in terms of a stress response. Now, the cool thing with oxytocin is that it's mirrored. So if I feel a sense of, I care for you, I want to support you, I believe I can support you, and I believe it will make a difference in your suffering, and I am willing to sit with you in that, if you genuinely believe that I am extending all of that loving kindness support, your body will release that oxytocin too. And then you will also feel good. This is what happens when, I keep picking this up. This is what happens when I have a therapy client just this week who I work in trauma, I specialize in trauma, and so I work with a lot of folks who have grown up in abusive households, all matters of abuse, so not just emotional, verbal, but also physical abuse, sexual abuse in some cases. And so I try to be mindful of checking in with them periodically. How are you experiencing therapy? Is it working for you? Are we doing what you want to do? Am I pushing you too hard? So I just try to check in with them. And this week I had a client who is autistic and experienced physical abuse from their parents for being autistic, for being different, which is unfair. And automatically when you hear that, you feel a certain way. And I checked in with this client and just said, how are we doing? Are we doing what you want to do? Are we achieving what you want to achieve? Am I pushing you too hard? All the usual questions. And their response was, well, I really hate it in the process. In the moment, I really hate it. But it's good. And I've been working with this client for a better part of a year. So when they say they hate it, I'm able to hear that. Like, I'm not taking offense to it. But they said, I really hate it in the moment, but it's good. And it's working. And people around me have told me it's working. So, and in the moment, I know that's why they keep coming back to get tortured by their crazy therapist, is because something is working in that, in allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to be seen, and allowing this compassionate dyad to form between, or really is a triad, me, God, and you, in the therapy room. That's why they come back. And I think any of the clergy in this room know that's why people come back to confession. It really hurts in the process, but they keep coming back for some reason. All right. So one other thing I want to say about the nervous system is, like, your nervous system has two basic modes. This is an oversimplification. I know the clinicians in the room are like, but there's two basic modes for your nervous system. You have your sympathetic, which is rising up in response. It's your threat mode, basically. And then you have your parasympathetic. So if you have a hard time remembering that, think of a parachute, slows you down from falling, right? So parasympathetic slows down your nervous system and says, rest and digest. And then the sympathetic will say, rise up, threat response, fight, flight. What compassion does, it starts as a stress response and then helps you get into your parasympathetic, rather than your sympathetic. And the way that your nervous system modes work, they're almost mutually exclusive. So you can't be in threat mode and be thinking in a relational sense. But you can be thinking in a relational sense if you're in your parasympathetic nervous system. So compassion enables you to be open to relationships. When you have that that mindset to be compassionate, to take another person's perspective, to choose to be present with them, to believe that I can do something about this, even if it means I just sit with them in it. You're just practicing being open to what Father Sean was talking about at the start, right? We're not creating something that didn't exist. You are now participating in it more fully by practicing compassion. And that's just evidence, right? Like the science stuff is just evidence of what theology is telling us is true. So here's what I want you all to take away from this is from the theology, we understand more fully what it means to be people, what it means to be a human person in communion with God, with each other. From the science, we just get the evidence of that in a small, tiny little portion, right? Something that we can quantify, something we can measure, something we can stick in an MRI machine and say, hey, look, that part of the brain, this part of the brain, and this part of the brain, right? It's just a little fraction of what is the reality, capital R reality, that Father Sean was talking about a minute ago. This is also why the Assembly of Bishops, we take this approach with ministry. We teach people how to think, and then we talk about how to do something. We bring it down to a skills level. And sometimes a skills level feels a little mechanical at first, but when you learn how to think, you can translate it into these little skills of, okay, here's how we actually practice that. Think of it similarly to a fasting rule. A fasting rule on its own doesn't really mean anything. It sounds a lot like a diet. But when you have the right mindset, you know how to think about it, okay, now it means something more. So I know the time is 12:15, and I think we're supposed to end at 12:15. So we are going to just skip our activity here that I had planned, which is totally okay. But what I'm going to have you do is just do the one part of the activity. So the activity was supposed to be in partners, taking turns sharing. One person is a listener, one person is a sharer. Sure, you got out of sharing your feelings today. Congratulations. But what I am going to have you do is, as part of that activity, I was going to have you close your eyes and do a little bit of a mindful reflection. So if you're willing, I would like to take 1 minute to do that with you to help build a sense of compassion. And if you're uncomfortable at any point sitting here and with your eyes closed, that's okay. You can look down at your feet instead. But if you can, if you're willing, just sit comfortably. You might have to wiggle around and shift your weight a little bit. Feet on the floor is ideal if your feet touch the floor. And I'm saying that as somebody who struggles to have their feet touch the floor sometimes. So sit comfortably, close your eyes, and I want you to just take a nice, full, deep breath. And I want you to visualize that breath coming in through your nose. Trace it to the back of your throat. And trace it all the way down to the bottom of your rib cage, where your diaphragm is. And as best as you can, I want you to follow a 4-8 ratio, and I'm going to count with you, where we're going to breathe in for 4 counts, and we're going to breathe out slowly for 8 counts. So with me, breathing in, 2, 3, 4, and out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. See if you can continue that. As you breathe, as you notice your body slowly relaxing, I want you to try to recall some of what you learned today. What does it mean to be a human person? What does it mean to be in communion or other, what does it mean to participate in the communion, in the community, already exists as a reality. With this last part, what does it mean to be compassionate? Am I willing to see compassion as an act of courage? When you're ready, you can open your eyes. So I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to have Father Sean kind of help give a little bit of a theological response to the science to help knit the two parts together, like you mentioned. One last thing I wanted to share, just my own perspective, and you can take it if you'd like, is that when I learn about compassion as a neurobiological process, it's kind of paradoxical. It's a stress response, but then it doesn't keep you in your sympathetic. When I see it as something that inhibits fear and encourages connection, the way I'm making sense of that as a clinician who is Orthodox Christian is, I think of the verse, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid. And that's a verse or a sentiment that is repeated many, many times. Most people quote it out of Joshua, but it's all throughout the Old Testament. And again, in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the most Jewish of the Gospels, some people would say, is when Jesus walks on water and his disciples get a little bit spooked. He says, do not be afraid, it is I. Right? And so for the Jews, they would remember how many times it was said, hopefully they read their Torah, they would remember how many times it was said in the Old Testament. Be strong, be of good courage, do not be afraid. That doesn't mean that you don't feel fear. This is why I say that compassion is a courageous response. You still feel the fear is still there. But the motivation to approach, to act anyway, to respond anyway, is stronger. That's the be strong. That's the be of good courage. That's the do not become that fear. So for me, that's how I knit these two things together. That's what I see as a clinician, what it means for me to be a compassionate presence for my clients until they're able to realize the whole time they've been learning self-compassion, participating in the compassion that's being freely given to them by Christ. So that's how I see that, and I would love, Father Sean, for you to share a few thoughts from your perspective.
Yeah, just briefly, I know there's probably a bit of ambivalence about how these things connect. And I guess I would suggest that the practices of compassion, if we're going to do the things that we do in order to be a compassionate presence, I would suggest that we must do those things from a Christian and or Orthodox perspective. And so, it fundamentally changed my counseling, my spiritual direction when I saw those folks and me become piles of dirt on the floor. I stopped being quite so active and aggressive in trying to seek an outcome, and just it allowed me to become more non-anxiously present. And so the wedding of the theology and the practice is, I think, something like that. Each one has to kind of do that work. I've encouraged a lot of chaplains in the military. You have got to, I suggest that you articulate your theology of human personhood so that it can inform your practice. And for me, that's what happened in that moment. And so the theology undergirds the practice, and doesn't just because the human being is more than a scientific and empirical reality doesn't necessarily mean that the human being is anything less than that. And so there's no need to throw all of that out what science can see of the biopsychosocial-spiritual person is worth attending to, always within the larger framework of the theological person. And so allowing that theology to inform the practice, and then perhaps making it more, making compassion something to we can approach with more facility. Because it is something of a skill, something of a skill set to do that. And perhaps the two work together to create greater ease, not lacking discomfort, but a greater ease of moving into that space. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I know we're.
Round of applause for Sangeetha and Father Sean.